Rain beats against the canvas of a convalescent ward tent outside Paris in March of 1945. In the third cot from the entrance lies Private Ray Nelson, a 21-year-old artillery observer resting a thick layer of gauze across his ruined eyes, his fingers constantly turning over a small carved wooden corncob whistle in his right hand. When a uniformed man quietly pulls up a folding stool beside the cot, Nelson does not pull to attention or offer a salutation. He leans toward the creaking seat, chuckles softly, and starts talking about the black soil of his family farm back in Iowa, completely convinced the man sitting next to him is just another wounded foot soldier fresh off the line across the narrow aisle. Lieutenant Ellen Vance of the Army Nurse Corps stops mid-stride, her hands freezing over a tray of morphine syringes as she registers the 3 gold stars gleaming on the visitor's collar. The tent goes quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when a low-ranking soldier casually addresses the commander of the Third Army like an old bunkmate. General George S. Patton does not interrupt the private, nor does he pull away. He sits completely still, listening to the young man talk without saying a word to reveal his rank. What happened in the next 60 seconds would reveal something about the commander that 4 years of brutal European warfare had completely obscured. And the answer was not what anyone in that ward was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring these forgotten moments of courage and quiet history to life every week. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it meant for Ray Nelson to sit in that canvas ward talking about black soil and corn crops, you need to understand what a convalescent tent near Paris actually was in the early spring of 1945. It was not a hospital in the civilian sense. It was a long holding station constructed of heavy green canvas, wooden floorboards, and kerosene heaters fighting a losing battle against the damp French cold. The air smelled of wet wool, cheap tobacco, floor disinfectant, and the sharp tang of dried blood. The noise was constant but quiet. The low groan of men shifting on narrow cots, the squeak of rubber soles on pine planks, and the steady drum of rain overhead. Hundreds of wounded soldiers passed through these tents every 48 hours, grouped not by regiment or rank, but by the nature of their wounds. In the eye wards, the light was kept low. Men lay with heavy gauze pads taped across their faces, forced to read their surroundings entirely through sound because sight had been taken from them by shrapnel, airbursts, or shattered glass. In that dark environment, hierarchy asserted itself through sound. Iron cleats on floorboards signaled a lieutenant. The sharp bark of a chief nurse meant dressings were being changed. Soldiers learned to read those auditory cues with absolute precision, but the distance between a 21-year-old private and a 3-star army commander was vast, separated by layers of military protocol and the sheer terror Patton's name usually inspired. An unannounced visit from General Patton typically brought white-glove scrutiny and an intense surge of anxiety among staff who remembered his ruthless reputation. Nurses froze where they stood, orderlies backed against the canvas walls. No lower enlisted man would ever speak without permission, let alone address the commander of the Third Army as if he were just another farm boy sitting on the next bed. By March of 1945, the Allied armies were forcing their way across the Rhine into the heartland of Germany, pushing divisions forward in a brutal drive to end the war. That speed created a staggering operational arithmetic for the medical corps behind the front lines. Every 24 hours was calculated in bed turnover rates, plasma units, train schedules, and surgical hours spent per casualty. Across Western Europe, thousands of shattered young men were being processed like material, reduced to daily statistics that reached Patton's map table every morning. At that scale of command, individual human lives become numbers in a vast logistics equation where speed is the only metric that counts. And that was the room Ray Nelson spoke in. Picture the scene. It is 3 o'clock on a cold March afternoon inside a drafty canvas ward tent outside Paris. Dim yellow light trickles through the lantern glass, casting long shadows across 30 narrow cots arranged along the pine floorboards. Rain hammers relentlessly against the oilskin roof, masking the distant thrum of heavy transport trucks. Lieutenant Ellen Vance stands frozen in the central aisle, her fingers clamped tight around a metal tray carrying glass syringes and fresh cotton dressings. Near the rear tent flap, an orderly holding a bucket of soapy water stops dead in his tracks, his eyes glued to the polished leather of General Patton's riding boots. On the third cot, Private Ray Nelson lies entirely still, his face covered by thick white gauze. his fingers turning over the small carved wooden corncob whistle he carried from Iowa. He thinks he is talking to just another private. Every nurse and medical corpsman in that tent knew the heavy ghost haunting the general's visits to medical wards. They remembered Sicily in 1943, when Patton's furious temper in hospital tents had nearly ended his military career. To the staff watching from the aisles, a three-star general standing over a casualty was not a routine inspection. It was a volatile situation waiting for a spark. Lieutenant Vance braced herself, mentally calculating whether she should step forward, announce the commander, and enforce basic military protocol before things went wrong. The whole room held its breath, waiting for the sharp bark of outrage that usually followed any breach of rank. Stay with me, because what happened next in that room is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from that rain-slicked canvas tent outside Paris are remarkably consistent in shape and detail. Lieutenant Ellen Vance stood entirely frozen in the narrow aisle, watching General George S. Patton move quietly toward the low wooden stool beside Private Nelson's cot. Not the way a commanding general sits down in a military hospital, not the way an officer approaches an enlisted man who has failed to present a proper salute. He sat down quietly, resting his heavy hands on his knees, leaning in close so the blinded soldier would not have to strain to be heard above the rain. As Ray Nelson talked on about the spring planting and the dark soil of his family farm in Iowa, Patton did not utter a single word to correct him. He did not mention his rank or the 3 gold stars on his collar. He reached out, gently took the young observer's hand, and listened in complete silence for 20 long minutes. When the private finally paused to catch his breath, Patton leaned closer and spoke softly. "I will visit your town after the war." The general stood up slowly, released the private's hand, and turned toward the tent flap. Lieutenant Vance would describe that departure later with a single word: deliberate. Patton did not issue a single instruction to the medical staff, nor did he check his pocket watch as he usually did when on a tight inspection schedule. Outside, his driver waited in an idling jeep, but Patton paused at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder at the dark ward and the 30 cots lined up in the dim lantern light before stepping out into the cold Paris rain without another word. See, what most folks don't realize is that true leadership under extreme pressure is rarely about the authority you assert in public. In the vast operational machinery of the Third Army, Patton was a commander who calculated victory in hard numbers. Kilometers gained, supply trucks moved, and artillery rounds fired per hour. Every entry on his map overlay was a cold exercise in military logistics, where human effort was converted into ground taken. But inside that canvas ward, the arithmetic was entirely different. To correct Ray Nelson in that moment, to interrupt a blinded private talking about his Iowa cornfields just to enforce military rank, would have cost a broken young man his only comfort for zero operational gain. Patton recognized that trade-off instantly. His silence was not passive, nor was it a lapse in discipline. It was a conscious decision to lay down his command and offer 20 minutes of simple human dignity to a soldier who had given everything. In a war measured by staggering casualties and brutal timetables, that quiet listening was an act of profound restraint, a moment where the commander of an entire army chose to listen rather than command. Ray Nelson was 21 years old. Born and raised on a 400-acre farm just outside Eldora, Iowa, his father, Arthur Nelson, was a quiet man who spent 40 winters mending broken tractor gears and turning hardwood offcuts into sturdy tools on an iron lathe in his drafty workshop. It was Arthur who had carved that small wooden corncob whistle out of soft white pine when Ray was 8 years old, hand sanding the rough edges until it fit seamlessly into the boy's coat pocket. Before enlisting in 1943 as an artillery observer, Ray worked 6 days a week as a county land surveyor's assistant, pacing off fence lines and calculating drainage slopes across Hardin County. He knew how to read terrain through tiny changes in soil color and elevation, a practical discipline that made him an exceptional observer on the front lines. Back in Iowa, his younger sister Ruth was completing high school, while a girl named Martha Miller wrote him long letters every Tuesday from her desk at the township hardware store, filling pages with news of the spring thaw and county fair preparations. Ray's post-war plan was entirely practical. Return home, purchase 40 acres of fertile bottomland along the Iowa River, and assume the county surveying contract. He was not a romantic hero chasing battlefield glory. He was the kind of man who looked at an open field and saw the exact amount of labor required to make it grow. When Lieutenant Vance sat on the edge of his cot 2 days later and softly explained that the silent soldier who had held his hand for 20 minutes was General George S. Patton, Ray did not gasp or freeze in disbelief. He simply paused, his bandaged face turning toward the sound of her voice, and ran his thumb over the worn grain of the carved wooden corncob whistle resting in his right hand. He nodded once, swallowed slowly, and asked if the general had happened to say when the next mail truck from Paris would arrive with letters from Iowa. For Ray, the exact rank of his visitor mattered far less than the simple comfort of having been heard by someone who was willing to listen. Lieutenant Ellen Vance remained with the Army Nurse Corps through the final months of the war, overseeing medical evacuations across Germany before returning home to Columbus, Ohio, in late 1945. She married an engineer, raised 3 children, and worked for over 30 years as a dedicated head nurse at a local hospital. She rarely spoke about the thousands of wounded men who had passed through her care, but until her retirement in 1982, she kept a small wooden stool in her garden that looked identical to the one beside Ray Nelson's cot. In a written account preserved by her family, she noted that of all the military figures she observed during the war, the moment that stayed with her forever was watching a feared 3-star commander sit entirely still in a dark tent, listening to a young man describe the soil of home. Was General Patton right to sit in that dark tent and let a blinded private speak to him like an equal? Some would say no. They argue that in a military machine fighting a brutal war, discipline is the only thing preventing collapse. Rank is not a suggestion. It is the rigid structure that keeps an army moving. By hiding his identity, a commanding officer was abandoning the strict protocol his own forces relied upon. Others would say exactly the opposite. They would argue that true leadership is knowing when the strict rules of war no longer apply. That in a canvas room filled with shattered men, enforcing a 3-star rank would have been a hollow victory of ego over humanity. By choosing to simply listen, a hardened commander offered the only comfort that mattered. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.